My name is Mia, and the morning I got uninvited from my own mother's birthday party started like any other Thursday in my small apartment on the east side of town, with cheap coffee brewing and my psychology textbook open on the kitchen table next to a stack of unpaid bills. I was 28 years old, working nights at a bar called Murphy's while studying during the day, living the kind of life my family had always looked at with thinly veiled disappointment, and I'd made peace with that. Or at least I thought I had, until my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Madison. "Don't come to Mom's 60th party. You'll ruin the family photos." I read it once, then twice, then a third time while my coffee went cold in my hand. And each time the words stayed exactly the same, sharp and deliberate and impossible to misunderstand. Madison had always been good with words, good at making cruelty sound like practicality. And this was her at her finest. 8 words that managed to communicate everything our family had never said out loud. That I was the mistake, the one who didn't fit, the daughter who'd chosen the wrong life and needed to be cropped out of the picture. I set the phone down on the counter and stared at the wall, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name yet, something that lived in the space between hurt and anger, and a strange kind of relief. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. And in that silence, I found myself thinking about other parties, other photos, the pattern that had been there all along if I'd been willing to see it clearly. Madison's high school graduation had been this huge event with 100 guests and a live band in our parents' backyard, white tablecloths and catered food, and a photographer who followed her around all night capturing her perfect moments. Mine had been 8 people around our dining room table with a sheet cake from Costco and my aunt's camera phone. Madison got the college fund, the one our grandparents had set up. All of it because she was going to study business and make something of herself. I got told I could work my way through if I really wanted it, which is exactly what I'd been doing for the past 6 years, one double shift at a time. I picked up my phone again and typed back a single word. Fine. My finger hovered over the send button for maybe 2 seconds before I pressed it, and then I sat there feeling the weight of that tiny word, how it could mean so many things. Agreement or resignation, or the kind of quiet fury that doesn't announce itself with exclamation points. Madison would read it as surrender, as me backing down the way I always had, and maybe 2 days ago that's exactly what it would have been. But something had changed in the reading of her text, in the casual cruelty of being uninvited from my own mother's 60th birthday because my presence was aesthetically inconvenient. I stood up and walked to my bedroom, pulled open the top drawer of my dresser where I kept important papers, and found the receipt I'd tucked away 3 months ago. Belmore Catering, paid in full, $3,200 for my mother's party, a surprise gift I'd been planning since January, saved up from 6 months of working double shifts and skipping meals, and saying no to anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I'd wanted to do something meaningful, something that would show I cared, even if I couldn't afford the kind of grand gestures Madison was famous for, and I'd paid for it all up front, because the caterer had offered a discount for early payment. I looked at that receipt for a long moment, at the confirmation number and the date, and the note I'd written to myself in the margin about making sure they knew about Mom's shellfish allergy, and then I picked up my phone again and made a call. "Belmore Catering, this is Jennifer. How can I help you?" My voice came out steady and calm, steadier than I felt. "Hi, Jennifer. I need to cancel an order and get a refund. The account holder is Mia Chen, confirmation number 4729B. There was a pause, the sound of typing, and then Jennifer's voice came back professional and efficient. "I see the order here. It's for this Saturday. Is there a problem with the service?" "No problem," I said. And I meant it, because for the first time in years I wasn't trying to fix something, or smooth something over, or make myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be. "I just need to cancel it. Full refund, please." "Absolutely, I'll process that right away. The refund should appear in 3 to 5 business days." I thanked her, and hung up. And then I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand, and felt something very close to peace settle over me. The kind that comes not from getting what you want, but from finally stopping the exhausting work of pretending you don't want anything different. Outside my window, the city moved on with its Thursday morning routine. completely indifferent to the small revolution happening in my tiny apartment. And that was fine too, because this one was just for me. 2 hours after I canceled the catering, my phone exploded with Madison's call. And I knew before I answered that whatever came next would be ugly in the way only family fights can be, the kind that reaches back through decades of unspoken resentments and pulls them all to the surface at once. "What did you do?" Her voice came through so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear, and I could hear other sounds behind her. Mom's voice high and panicked, Dad's deeper rumble, the chaos of a crisis in full bloom. "Mia, what the hell did you do?" I took a sip of my fresh coffee, the one I'd made after the call to Belmore Catering, and my hand was perfectly steady even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I canceled the catering for Mom's party." "You what? You can't just... That's not... We have 60 people coming on Saturday." The words tumbled out frantic and furious, and I heard Madison's perfect composure cracking in real time. "Mom is having a breakdown. The caterer said the account holder canceled everything. How could you be so selfish?" Something hot flared in my chest at that word. Selfish. And I set my coffee cup down harder than I meant to, the porcelain clicking sharp against the counter. "You told me not to come because I'd ruin the family photos, Madison. I just made sure I wouldn't ruin anything else." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow like she'd been running. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the tone she used for closing business deals, calculated and cold. "This is about the text? Jesus, Mia, I was trying to protect you. Everyone's going to be asking questions about your life, and I thought it would be easier if you just... It wasn't personal. It was entirely personal." My voice came out quiet, but I wasn't backing down. Not this time. And I could feel something fundamental shifting in me with every word. I saved for 6 months for that party, Madison. 6 months of double shifts and skipped meals and saying no to everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I paid $3,200 because I wanted to do something meaningful for Mom's birthday. And you texted me like I was a stain you needed to remove before company came over. I heard her inhale sharply. Heard the exact moment she realized what I'd just said. What I'd just done. "You paid for the catering? That was going to be from you?" "It was going to be from me." Past tense, deliberate, final. "But you made it very clear where I stand in this family. So I made it very clear where my money stands." Madison's voice climbed higher, desperate now. "Mia, please, we can fix this. I'll apologize to everyone. I'll tell them it was a misunderstanding. Just call them back. And we need that catering. Mom is already crying, and Dad is furious, and the guests are confirmed, and please." For just a second I felt it. The old familiar pull to smooth things over, and make myself smaller, and fix the problem I'd created by having feelings. But then I remembered her text message. Those 8 casual words that had summed up a lifetime of being less than, and the pull dissolved into something harder and clearer. "No," I said, and hung up. The phone started ringing again immediately, but I silenced it, then blocked Madison's number, then Mom's when she tried, then Dad's, then my Aunt Karen's, watching the notifications pile up like evidence of exactly how much I'd never mattered, except when my absence became inconvenient. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with what I'd done, and I sat down hard on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and let myself cry. Not pretty tears, but the ugly kind that come from somewhere deep and painful. Years of being invisible finally forcing their way out. I cried until I couldn't anymore, until my face was swollen and my throat was raw. And then I got up and got ready for my shift at Murphy's, because the world didn't stop just because your family did. And sometimes the best thing you can do is show up for your own life even when everything else is falling apart. The bar was quiet for a Thursday night, just the regulars and a few college kids shooting pool in the back, and I was grateful for the familiar rhythm of pouring drinks and wiping down the counter and not having to think about anything more complicated than whether someone wanted their whiskey neat or on the rocks. I was pulling a beer when Jake sat down at his usual spot at the end of the bar, and he took one look at my face and said the thing that would change everything. "Rough day?" I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in the 6 months he'd been coming in, and saw someone who might actually want to hear the truth instead of a polite lie. You could say that. He smiled, gentle and genuine, and pushed his empty glass toward me for a refill. Tell me about it. So I did. I didn't mean to tell Jake everything that night at Murphy's, but once I started talking, the whole story came spilling out like water from a broken dam, and he just sat there listening with the kind of attention that made me realize how long it had been since anyone had actually heard me, instead of just waiting for their turn to tell me what I was doing wrong. He didn't offer solutions or try to fix anything. He just nodded in the right places and ordered another beer and let me be messy and angry and hurt without making it about him. Family's complicated, he said finally when I'd run out of words, and there was something in his voice that told me he knew exactly what kind of complicated I meant. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the worst, because they think they have the right. I wiped down the bar between us even though it was already clean, needing something to do with my hands. I blocked all their numbers. Is that crazy? Blocking your whole family 2 days after ruining your mom's birthday party? Did you ruin it, or did you just stop paying for your own exclusion? The question hit me sideways, and I had to stop and think about it. Really think about what I'd actually done versus what I'd been conditioned to believe I'd done, and the difference was so stark it almost made me laugh. When you put it like that. I'm a photographer, Jake said, which seemed like a complete non sequitur until he kept talking. I spend a lot of time looking at how people arrange themselves for pictures, what they show and what they hide, and I can tell you that sometimes the best family photos are the ones that show the truth instead of the fantasy. Something about that sentence kept echoing in my head for days afterward, playing on repeat while I went to class and studied and worked my shifts and avoided looking at my phone even though I'd unblocked everyone after the first night, because staying angry takes more energy than I had to spare. The messages had piled up, 37 from Madison alone, ranging from furious to pleading to coldly informative about how they'd found a different caterer and the party was happening with or without me, and I deleted them all without reading past the first line, because I was done letting other people's emergencies become my crisis. Instead, I focused on myself for what felt like the first time in my adult life, and it was strange and uncomfortable and weirdly liberating all at once. I'd been carrying around this background noise of family disappointment for so long that its absence left a kind of ringing silence, and I had to figure out how to fill that space with something other than guilt and the endless work of trying to be good enough for people who'd already decided I wasn't. I found a support group for adults with toxic family relationships, which sounds dramatic until you're sitting in a circle with 12 other people who all have some version of the same story. The golden child and the scapegoat. The parents who pit siblings against each other. The love that comes with so many conditions it stops feeling like love at all. There was Maria, whose brother got the family business while she got told her ideas were too risky, and David, whose parents still introduced him as their disappointing son at 73 years old. And listening to them, I realized I wasn't crazy or ungrateful or selfish. I was just finally seeing the pattern clearly, instead of pretending it didn't exist. Jake kept showing up at Murphy's, always at the end of the bar, always with that same easy smile that never demanded anything from me. And somewhere in the third week, he asked if I'd be interested in modeling for a photography project he was working on. It's about authenticity, he explained. Real people in their real spaces, not posed or filtered, just honest. I almost said no out of reflex because I'd spent 28 years believing I wasn't the kind of person anyone would want to photograph. But then I thought about what honest looked like, and whether I was brave enough to let someone see it. And I heard myself saying yes before I could talk myself out of it. He came to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon with his camera and no agenda, and I felt hideously self-conscious at first standing there in my tiny kitchen with my secondhand furniture, and my stack of psychology textbooks, and my plants that I'd somehow kept alive despite everything else falling apart. But Jake moved around the space like he was looking for something specific, and when he started taking pictures, it wasn't of me posing, but of me being, reading on my couch with my legs tucked under me, watering my plants by the window, sitting at my kitchen table with my notes spread out, and my coffee going cold while I highlighted a passage about family systems theory. Later, when he showed me the photos on his camera screen, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I looked present and real, and like someone who belonged in her own life. And something cracked open in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. "These are beautiful," I said quietly. Jake smiled and started packing up his equipment. "You're beautiful," I just pointed the camera. He left before I could figure out how to respond, and I sat alone in my apartment, holding that compliment carefully, like something fragile and new, letting myself believe it might be true. 3 weeks after the canceled party, Mom texted me asking to meet for coffee, just the two of us, and I stared at that message for a full 10 minutes, trying to decide if I had the emotional capacity for whatever conversation was about to happen. Part of me wanted to ignore it the way I'd ignored everything else, but there was something in the phrasing, the simplicity of just the two of us, that made me curious enough to say yes. We met at a coffee shop halfway between her house and my apartment, neutral territory that neither of us had claimed, and when I walked in, she was already sitting at a corner table looking smaller somehow than I remembered, like the past few weeks had taken something out of her that went deeper than just a canceled birthday party. She stood when she saw me, started to reach for a hug, then stopped herself, and we ended up doing this awkward half-wave thing that would have been funny if it wasn't so desperately sad. "Thank you for coming," she said, once we'd both sat down with our coffees, hers black the way she'd always drunk it, mine with too much cream because I'd never learned to like the bitterness. "I wasn't sure you would." I wrapped my hands around my cup and waited, because I'd learned in my psychology classes that sometimes silence is the most powerful thing you can offer. And sure enough, after a moment, she started talking in this rush of words that sounded like she'd been holding them back for years. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just let me say it all before you respond, okay?" She didn't wait for me to agree, just kept going with her eyes fixed on her coffee cup, like she couldn't bear to look at me while she said what came next. "I've always found it easier with Madison, because she was easier to understand, easier to control, easier to shape into what I thought a daughter should be. But you, Mia, you were always so intense and questioning and independent, and that scared me because you were everything I'd spent my whole life suppressing in myself." I felt something shift in my chest, but I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "When I was your age, I wanted to teach art," she said, "and this was news to me. This piece of my mother I'd never known existed. I had a portfolio ready for the teaching credential program and everything planned out. But your father said it wasn't practical, that we needed stability, that I could paint as a hobby, but teaching was just setting myself up for disappointment. So I gave it up and I married him, and I had you girls. And I convinced myself I'd made the right choice, because that's what you do. You make sacrifices for family." She finally looked up at me and her eyes were wet. "But then you came along refusing to make the same sacrifices, choosing bartending and night school over the safe corporate path, and instead of being proud of you for having the courage I never had, I resented you for it. I let your father and Madison dictate how we treated you because it was easier than admitting I'd spent 30 years making the wrong choices." The coffee shop noise faded into background static, and all I could hear was my mother's voice cracking around the edges, finally telling me the truth after 28 years of pretending everything was fine. "The party got canceled and Madison was furious with both of us. And your father hasn't spoken to me in days except to tell me this is my fault for coddling you. And I realized I don't even know who I am anymore outside of being his wife and your girl's mother." "Mom," I started, but she shook her head. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't know if I deserve that. I just needed you to know that none of this was ever really about you being wrong. It was about me being too afraid to be right." We sat there in the coffee shop crying quietly into our coffee cups. Two women finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. And I realized that sometimes understanding someone doesn't fix the hurt they caused, but it does make it possible to carry it differently. When we finally left, I didn't hug her, but I did touch her shoulder, brief and tentative, and she covered my hand with hers for just a second before we walked away in opposite directions. My phone buzzed as I reached my car, a LinkedIn notification about a job posting, and when I opened it, I saw a message from someone I didn't know offering me an interview for a junior counselor position at a youth psychology clinic, full-time with benefits at $42,000 a year, exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward for 6 years. I sat in my car and started laughing, the kind that turns into crying and back again, Because sometimes life gives you exactly what you need right when you're finally ready to receive it. I got the job at Riverside Youth Clinic 3 weeks after the interview, and walking into that building on my first day felt like stepping into a version of my life I'd only ever imagined in abstract terms, the one where my choices actually led somewhere, instead of just away from what my family wanted. The work was harder than I'd expected. Sitting across from teenagers whose pain was so raw and present, it made my family drama look like a minor inconvenience. But it was also the first time in my adult life that I went to bed exhausted and woke up eager instead of the other way around. Zoe came to me in my 3rd week, a 16-year-old with dark circles under her eyes and a portfolio of charcoal drawings she kept hidden in her backpack like contraband. Her parents wanted her to go pre-med, had her whole life mapped out in 5-year increments, and she sat in my office twisting her hands together while she told me about panic attacks and sleepless nights, and the growing certainty that if she followed their plan, she'd wake up at 40 and realize she'd lived someone else's entire life. I saw myself in her so clearly it hurt, and I had to be careful not to project my own story onto hers. But I also knew exactly what it felt like to be told your dreams weren't practical enough to deserve air. "What do you want?" I asked her, and she looked at me like no one had ever asked her that question before. "I want to go to art school," she whispered. "I want to draw and paint and maybe fail at it, but at least know I tried instead of spending my whole life wondering what if." We worked together over the next few months, building a case for her autonomy, documenting the emotional toll of her parents' pressure, connecting her with resources and legal aid, and watching her find her voice in increments so small they were almost invisible until suddenly they weren't. It was slow and frustrating and punctuated by setbacks, but when she finally stood up to her parents and told them she was choosing herself, I felt something settle in my chest that I'd been carrying around broken for years. Jake had become part of my routine by then, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet accumulation of coffee before my shifts and walks through the park on Sunday mornings, and conversations that stretched past midnight about everything and nothing. He told me about his divorce at 30, how his family had cut him off for failing at marriage like it was a moral deficiency, instead of just 2 people who'd wanted different things. And I told him about growing up invisible in a house full of people who saw me perfectly clearly, but chose to look away. "We're both refugees from the same war," he said one night while we sat on my apartment steps, watching the streetlights flicker on. "Different battles, same casualties." When he kissed me for the first time, it wasn't cinematic or earth-shattering. It was just easy and right, and like something that had been waiting to happen since that first night at Murphy's when he'd asked me about my rough day and actually meant it. We didn't rush into anything, both of us too aware of how complicated people could make simple things. But we also didn't pretend we were just friends when we were clearly becoming something more. Madison showed up at the clinic on a random Tuesday afternoon, walking into the reception area like she owned it, and I felt my whole body tense before I even saw her face. "We need to talk," she said, not asking. And I led her to my office because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of making a scene in front of my colleagues. "I'm trying," she said before I could say anything, sitting in the chair my patients usually occupied and looking more tired than I'd ever seen her. "I'm trying to understand why you did what you did, and Mom keeps defending you and Dad's barely speaking to either of us, and I just need to know if you're happy now that you've torn this family apart." The old me would have absorbed that accusation and carried it around like penance, but the new me who'd spent 3 months helping Zoe find her courage wasn't interested in taking responsibility for a family that had been broken long before I stopped pretending it wasn't. "You think it's easy being perfect?" she continued before I could respond, and her voice cracked around the edges. "I'm exhausted, Mia, every single day." That's when Zoe knocked on my door holding a brochure with shaking hands, and everything else became secondary to the fear in her eyes when she showed me what her parents had planned. The brochure Zoe handed me was glossy and professional, the kind that makes imprisonment sound like opportunity, and across the front in cheerful letters it read, "Sunrise Academy for Behavioral Correction," with an intake date stamped in red for that Friday 3 days away. Her parents had decided that if she wouldn't choose medicine willingly, then she needed to be corrected, reprogrammed, sent away to a place that specialized in breaking teenagers down and rebuilding them into compliant versions of someone else's dream. "They said it's for my own good," Zoe whispered. and Madison was still sitting in my office watching this unfold with growing understanding on her face. They said I'm being selfish and dramatic, and that 2 months at Sunrise will help me see things clearly. I looked at that brochure and felt rage so pure and focused, it made my hands steady instead of shake. And I knew in that moment that every single thing I'd gone through with my own family had been preparing me for exactly this, for the chance to stand between a kid and the people who loved her enough to destroy her for her own good. "You're not going," I said, and my voice came out calm and absolute. "I promise you, Zoe, you're not going to that place." The next 72 hours were a controlled blur of phone calls and documentation, and meetings with my supervisor and social services, building a case for intervention with the kind of methodical precision I'd learned in school, but had never had to deploy in real life. Madison left my office that day without another word, but she called me that night and said something I never expected. "Tell me what you need." And I gave her the name of a family lawyer who specialized in emancipation cases, and she had someone from her husband's firm on the phone within an hour. Zoe's parents fought it the way people fight when they genuinely believe they're right, with tears and anger and accusations that we were enabling their daughter's destruction. But the evidence was there in black and white. The panic attacks and the weight loss and the documented emotional abuse of telling a child that her dreams were worthless unless they matched your own. The hearing was brutal and necessary, and when the judge granted Zoe partial emancipation and ordered her parents to allow her enrollment in the arts program at Lincoln High, I watched this girl I'd known for 3 months stand up straighter than I'd ever seen her stand. My supervisor, Dr. Chen, pulled me aside afterward. A woman in her 50s who'd built the clinic from nothing and had seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable. "You did good work here, Mia. Real, lasting work. Don't let anyone tell you different." That validation settled into my bones in a way that no amount of family approval ever had, because it was earned through action instead of given conditionally. And I realized that I'd been chasing the wrong kind of recognition my entire life. Dad called me that night, the first time we'd spoken since I'd canceled the catering, and his voice was tight with the kind of anger that mistakes itself for righteousness. "Your mother tells me you're counseling troubled teens now, and apparently you've decided that helping a child defy her parents is good therapy. This family is falling apart because of your selfishness, Mia, and I need you to fix it." I stood in my apartment listening to him deliver this speech he'd probably been rehearsing for weeks, and I felt nothing but a kind of tired clarity. "No, Dad," I said, when he finally paused for breath. "This family fell apart a long time ago. I'm just the first one honest enough to admit it." The silence that followed was so complete I thought he'd hung up, but then I heard him breathing, fast and shallow like I'd punched him, and before he could respond, I added the thing I'd needed to say for 28 years. "I'm done apologizing for existing wrong. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be with the person I actually am, not the daughter you wish you'd had." Then I hung up and blocked his number, and Jake showed up 20 minutes later with takeout and the kind of quiet presence that didn't need explanations. And we ate cold noodles on my kitchen floor while I told him about Zoe and the hearing, and my father's voice, finally losing its power to make me small. "What do you really want from them?" Jake asked eventually. "Closure? Revenge? Or just peace?" I thought about it for a long time. Long enough that the noodles went cold, and the apartment grew dark except for the streetlight coming through my window. "I don't know," I said finally. "Maybe I just want them to see me." My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Dinner Friday. Just us. I want to try again. The right way this time." I showed it to Jake, and he squeezed my hand. "Your call." It was my call. All of it. And that alone felt like progress. Mom's house looked the same as it always had when I pulled up Friday evening. The manicured lawn and the flower beds she obsessed over, and the porch light that she always left on, even though Dad complained about the electric bill. But something felt different about walking up those steps, knowing I'd been invited instead of expected, wanted instead of tolerated. She opened the door before I could knock, and I could smell garlic and tomatoes and the specific combination of spices she used in her pasta sauce, the one she'd made for my birthday every year until I turned 18, and birthdays became something we acknowledged with phone calls instead of celebrations. "He's on a business trip," she said before I could ask. And we both knew that Dad didn't take business trips on Friday nights, that this was him avoiding confrontation, the way he'd avoided everything uncomfortable for as long as I could remember. It's just us. The table was set for two with the good plates she usually saved for company, and there were candles lit even though it was still light outside. And I realized this was Mom trying in the only language she knew, the language of perfect presentation and careful staging. Except this time it felt less like performance and more like offering. We sat down across from each other and served ourselves in silence, the kind that felt fragile and important, and I waited for her to speak first because this was her dinner, her attempt, her move to make. I've been thinking a lot about what I said at the coffee shop, she started, pushing pasta around her plate without eating it. About giving up art and making sacrifices and being afraid. And I realized I've been living someone else's life for so long, I don't even know what mine would look like anymore. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were clear and sad and honest. Your father has controlled the narrative in this house for 32 years, made every decision and set every expectation, and I let him because it was easier than fighting, and I told myself that's what good wives do. They compromise and support, and make their husbands happy, even when it makes them miserable. I set down my fork and really looked at her, this woman who'd raised me and disappointed me and hurt me, and who I'd never actually seen as a whole person separate from being my mother. Madison became an extension of that narrative, she continued. The perfect daughter doing all the perfect things, and I poured everything into her because she was proof that I'd made the right choices, that sacrificing my dreams had been worth it, because look at this successful daughter I'd produced. Her voice cracked. But you refused to play along, and instead of admiring that, I resented it, because every choice you made for yourself was a mirror showing me all the choices I'd been too afraid to make. We sat there with her confession hanging in the air between us, and I felt something complicated rising in my chest that was part anger and part grief and part understanding, because I could see now how we'd all been trapped in the same system, just playing different roles, and none of us had been brave enough to admit it until everything fell apart. I met with a lawyer last week, she said quietly. Just a consultation. I haven't done anything yet, but I wanted to know what separation would look like, what my options are, whether I'm too old to start over. She laughed, but it came out bitter. 60 years old, and I'm finally asking myself what I want. I reached across the table and took her hand, this small gesture that felt enormous. It's not too late, Mom. It's never too late to choose yourself. She squeezed my hand and we both started crying. Not the pretty tears of reconciliation in movies, but the messy kind that come from years of miscommunication and pain finally being acknowledged. And we didn't fix anything that night, but we did start the slow work of being honest with each other, which felt like its own kind of fixing. When I left hours later, she walked me to my car and asked the question I knew was coming. Can you forgive me someday? I thought about it, really thought about what forgiveness meant and whether I had it in me, and what would happen if I didn't. I don't know, Mom, I said finally, but I can try to understand you, and maybe that's enough for now. She nodded like she'd expected that answer, like she knew she didn't deserve easy absolution, and I drove home feeling something unfamiliar and fragile that took me until I pulled into my apartment complex to recognize as peace. Jake was sitting on my steps waiting for me with coffee from the place down the street that stayed open late, and I sat down next to him and let him put his arm around me while I told him about dinner and my mother's confession and the strange feeling of seeing your parent as a person instead of just a parent. He listened the way he always did, present and patient, and then he said something that made my stomach drop. I need to tell you something. I got a job offer in Portland. It's a huge opportunity, but it means leaving in 6 weeks, and I don't know what to do because I don't want to lose this. He gestured between us. I don't want to lose you. Portland was 1,000 miles away, and Jake's job offer was the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice. A lead photographer position at a gallery that specialized in documentary work, the exact career he'd been building toward for years. And I sat on my apartment steps next to him, feeling panic rise in my throat like water. The old familiar fear of being left behind by people who had better options than staying with me. Say something, he said quietly, and I realized I'd been silent for too long. processing through all the ways this could go wrong, all the patterns I'd learned from watching my parents' hollow marriage and Madison's picture-perfect life that was currently falling apart behind closed doors. "I don't want you to stay for me and resent it later," I said finally. "I don't want to be the reason you give up something important." He turned to face me fully, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "That's not what I'm asking, Mia. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your life. I'm asking if you want to build something together on our own terms, whatever that looks like." His voice was steady and certain. "Maybe that means long distance for a while, or maybe it means you come with me, or maybe it means something we haven't thought of yet. But I need to know if you're willing to try, instead of just assuming it won't work." I thought about my job at the clinic that I loved, about Zoe and the other kids who'd started trusting me, about the tiny apartment that had become the first place that ever felt entirely mine. And then I thought about Jake, and the way he'd seen me clearly from that first night at Murphy's, never asking me to be smaller or different or easier. And I realized the question wasn't really about geography at all. "I need time to think," I said, and he nodded and kissed my forehead and left me alone with the biggest decision I'd had to make in a life that had recently become nothing but big decisions. Madison showed up at my apartment 2 days later without warning, and when I opened the door, she looked nothing like the polished, successful sister I'd grown up resenting. Her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes red like she'd been crying for days. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and she walked into my small space, looking around like she'd never seen how I actually lived, taking in the secondhand furniture and the psychology books and the photos Jake had taken that I'd finally framed and hung on my walls. "My marriage is over," she said without preamble, sitting on my couch like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "Mark had an affair, probably more than one, and the girls are acting out because they can feel everything falling apart, and I'm so tired of pretending everything's perfect when it's all just broken underneath." I sat down across from her and waited, because I'd learned that sometimes people need space to collapse before they can start rebuilding. She told me everything, the affairs and the fights and the crushing pressure of maintaining the image of success while everything crumbled behind closed doors, and I saw clearly for the first time how we'd both been prisoners of the same system, just in different cells. "I can't fix your life, Madison," I said when she finally stopped talking. "But I can be your sister, if you're willing to be mine for real this time, not the performance version." She looked at me with something like hope mixed with fear. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be anything other than perfect." "Neither did I said. "But I'm learning." She left an hour later with the names of 3 therapists I trusted, and I sat alone in my apartment thinking about choices and consequences, and the strange way life sometimes gives you exactly what you need, right when you're ready to receive it. That's when my phone rang with the call that changed everything. Mom's voice shaking on the other end. "Mia, I'm at the hospital. I need you to come." The emergency room smelled like antiseptic and fear, and when I walked in, I found them all exactly where I expected. Richard standing by the vending machines pretending to read his phone. Madison pacing near the nurse's station with her perfect composure finally cracked wide open. And somewhere behind those double doors, my mother fighting to stay alive because her body had finally rebelled against 60 years of swallowing everything she actually felt. "She's stable," Madison said when she saw me, her voice raw like she'd been crying for hours. "Mild heart attack. They're running tests, but she kept asking for you." Richard looked up then, and his face did something complicated. Anger and relief and resentment, all fighting for space. And I realized I didn't care anymore which one won, because his opinion of me had stopped mattering somewhere between the canceled catering and learning how to see myself through eyes that actually valued what they saw. "This is the stress you caused," he said, low and vicious. "You and your selfishness, tearing this family apart." Something in me went very still and very clear, and I walked right up to him until we were close enough that he couldn't look away. "No, Dad. This family was already torn apart. You just got really good at arranging the pieces so no one could see the cracks. Mom had a heart attack because she spent 32 years pretending to be happy in a marriage that died decades ago. And you're standing here blaming me because it's easier than admitting you built your entire life on making everyone else smaller so you could feel big." His face went red, and Madison made a small sound like she'd been holding her breath for 28 years, and finally let it out. And before he could respond, a doctor came through the double doors asking for family. We all followed her back to where Mom lay connected to monitors that beeped steadily. And when she saw me, her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, and I took her hand carefully around the IV line. "I'll always come, Mom, but not for the performance anymore, only for the truth." She nodded like she understood, and then she looked past me to where Richard stood rigid in the doorway. "I want a divorce," she said, clear and certain despite the oxygen tube in her nose. "I've wasted enough time." The monitor showed her heart rate spike, and the nurse moved in to check her vitals, but Mom waved her off impatiently. "I'm fine. I'm better than fine. I'm finally honest." She looked at Richard and something like pity crossed her face. "You can keep the house and the perfect lawn and the image of success. I'm taking my life back." I stayed with her for 3 hours, while Richard left without a word, and Madison sat in the corner processing the demolition of everything she'd thought was solid. And somewhere in those quiet hours, Mom told me about the art classes she'd already signed up for, and the lawyer she'd hired before the heart attack, and the apartment she'd been looking at that had good light for painting. "I'm 60 years old," she said. "That's not too late to start over, is it?" "It's never too late," I told her, and I meant it. 2 weeks later, I accepted the position in Portland, not because I was following Jake, but because it was the exact opportunity I'd been working toward. Better pay and more responsibility, and a chance to build something meaningful in a city where nobody knew me as the disappointing daughter. Jake and I loaded up a rental truck with my life packed into boxes, and Madison showed up to help carrying coffee in an envelope. "This is from Mom," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a check for $3,200 and a note that read, "For the party you paid for. Use it for your new start instead." Madison hugged me then, awkward and genuine, and whispered, "I'm starting therapy. Maybe we can talk sometimes, like actual sisters." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. My new apartment in Portland had big windows and room for all my plants, and on my first day at the clinic I met a girl who reminded me of myself at 16, all sharp edges and hidden dreams. "Tell me your story," I said gently, settling into my chair, "and let's figure out together what you really need." She started talking, and I started listening, and I thought about how the best revenge isn't punishment. It's living well and authentically, and using your pain to keep someone else from drowning in theirs. I'd chosen my own life finally, and it turned out that was the only choice that had ever really mattered.